Thank you and good morning. Welcome to AWS Media Day here in Seoul. I'm very excited to be here with you. I'm Ben Masek. I'm the Worldwide Business Development Lead for Media and Entertainment over at AWS. And we have a lot to talk about. I'm going to try to cover it fairly quickly over the next 40 minutes or so. But what I'll cover primarily is going to involve an overview of industry megatrends. We'll talk about the many value propositions that we're seeing for our customers as they're wanting to move towards cloud adoption on AWS. We'll talk a lot about media workflows, about media workloads, how those align to your business processes, and we'll talk about the different approaches of how to run those media workflows on AWS. We'll then actually dive a little bit deeper looking at different customer use cases and better understanding how many of your peers throughout the media and entertainment industry have actually been utilizing for AWS for several years now. And finally, I will quickly introduce you to some of the excitement that we're beginning to see with artificial intelligence, machine learning, all regarding media use cases on AWS. But to get started, I like to go back to a flywheel approach of viewing things, and this is very Amazonian. We're very much into being able to build out these flywheels and show how ultimately these can self-perpetuate. And in our media industry, ultimately there are two aspects, there are two groupings that are extremely important. At the core, there's the end consumer, the folks that we're wanting to please, that we're wanting to delight with great content on the other end. And our flywheel here initially starts with having good content. And with that good content, we eventually will get more viewers. In this new digital age that we're moving into, having more viewers becomes that much more important if we can also obtain better data, a better understanding of what our customers want, of what they're wanting to watch. And with that better data, we can make better decisions. And that really becomes core to this flywheel effect, because with better decisions, we can do things such as better monetize our content, we can better understand which shows will work and attract consumers that much better, and ultimately, we can turbocharge this flywheel. We can make, once again, better targeted monetization decisions, better targeted recommendations to end users. We can run our operations with greater agility. And what you're going to see throughout the presentation is a lot of the themes, a lot of the benefits from a media perspective really tie back to understanding this flywheel. As far as major trends worldwide, so much of what we've been seeing for quite a few years now is actually reflected in this graph in the upper left. In the blue line, we're representing, this is actually in the US, the continual decline in terms of pay TV subscribers. This phenomena is primarily linked to cord cutting, and it really has to do with a lot of the end consumers wanting to change the manner in which they're experiencing and consuming content. Of course, many of your children, and now even a lot of your parents are actually realizing the benefits of being able to watch what it is you want to watch, anytime you want to do it, anywhere you want to do it, and on any device. It turns out this phenomenon of cord cutting is really happening worldwide. And if anything, we're actually seeing a lot more prevalence in South Korea due to just how advanced your broadband ecosystem really is. Another major set of trends that we're seeing throughout the industry, one has to do with just this overall shift in terms of where ad dollars are going. Traditionally, for quite some time, we have it shown as TV, but as it turns out, pretty much the same black graph that we see right here, that for the last couple of years is almost stagnating, showing very little growth, has to do with TV broadcast ad revenues. And the same actually has been true in radio as well as publishing and other parts of the traditional media business. And at the same time, of course, we've seen a tremendous growth in digital ad spend, so much so that digital ad spend worldwide is actually overtaken the amount in TV spend just in the last year or so. Another major trend that we're seeing on the right side has to do with the amount of content being produced worldwide. In this chart right here, we're primarily showing scripted series for television, but the same holds true in feature and other parts of the industry. So we're seeing continual growth. The state of content production in most areas around the world is actually quite healthy. I live in Southern California, not too far from a lot of the Hollywood studios. And in general, we're seeing a very healthy economy. Obviously, there's a lot of great production happening in Korea as well. But the major shift that we're seeing has to do with the growth in the purple bar right here. The purple actually represents, and I apologize, I know it's a little difficult to see, but the purple actually represents digital online services such as Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Video, and many others. And as it turns out, there are a lot more of those online service providers spending more money on production, on original content. It's estimated that in 2017, roughly $7 to $8 billion were spent by Netflix to either acquire or actually build out and produce their own content for their streaming solution. Sorry. Other mega trends that we'll just showcase very quickly, just because they're so pertinent and so recent in some cases, is first off, what's happening with Disney. I think, just like me, many of you found out in December that Disney has decided to acquire 21st Century Fox. And that actually is a big, big deal throughout the industry. Disney is probably the biggest, or certainly one of the biggest producers of content out there. Yet Disney felt that in order to be able to better handle and compete head-on with Netflix, they wanted to actually broaden their content library and their content production capacity. With 21st Century Fox, they'll certainly have a lot of that, and Disney now actually is realizing that this industry is rapidly changing. They're planning by end of 2018, 2019, I believe I've been reading, that they will have probably 2 streaming offerings. One platform that will primarily focus on their content library, a lot of their TV and feature shows, and the other will actually focus more on Sports Live. But this really signals, I think, to the rest of the industry that without a doubt, the direction is clearly moving towards more streaming types of services. Much of what we're seeing throughout the industry, we began talking about on the flywheel, has to do with the changes in which cloud can help with areas such as personalization. Through the use of AI or artificial intelligence, for instance, we can help optimize recommendation engines, something that Netflix, Hulu, and many others do very well. Another area where it's helping quite a bit has to do with determining which shows to greenlight, which shows to actually finance or not. And a lot of that decision in the past was primarily based on gut, but more and more with some of our more advanced customers, we're seeing people who are actually basing aspects of that decision on data, on more analytics, and on AI in certain cases. And then finally, the very last trend that we'll talk about here has to do with the verticalization of the industry. And I think this is something that is slowly occurring, but it's something that we saw a few years back with Comcast acquiring NBCU. We've seen other telcos, such as Verizon, acquiring more media properties, such as Yahoo, AOL, and others. And more recently, of course, we're seeing AT&T, a very large telco, wanting to actually purchase and in the process of purchasing Time Warner that has tremendous assets. And a big reason behind this drive for telcos to actually acquire these media companies really has to do with the fact that these larger telcos have a good relationship or a good understanding of what it is their end consumers want to watch, what it is that they want to actually consume. They have a lot of extra data that some of the traditional studios, for instance, like Sony Pictures, like Warner Brothers, like Disney, at least in the older days, don't necessarily have. A lot of these studios know how to make great, compelling, beautiful content, but in many cases don't necessarily have all of that additional insight in terms of what the consumers want. And this is really part of what AT&T is angling for, is this ability to actually leverage their understanding of end consumers and tie that into great content that Time Warner has. And once again, Time Warner will benefit from the fact that now they'll actually have those additional insights. And I think a great way to illustrate it actually is this quote from Randall Stevenson, who's the CEO over at AT&T. And DirecTV, which is part of AT&T, will be able to command advertising rates at 2 to 3 times the rates that Turner now receives for that same content. So Turner being part of Time Warner, really what the CEO is saying is that from a business model perspective, they can actually get huge increases simply by being smarter, being able to use AI and other technologies and leverage that data that they have. Most of our customers ultimately are compelled to move to the cloud, to AWS in particular, because they're running across 4 common challenge areas. One has to do with content growth. In the case of content production, as we explained earlier, we're seeing a lot more content being produced, and a lot of that more additional content being produced is also being produced at higher quality, at higher bit rates, at higher resolution. We're doing now mostly HD content production. In many cases, a lot of the producers are also now working in 4K or ultra high definition, UHD. Many are using HDR, high dynamic range. And this ultimately just adds to the scale, to the size of the files that are needing to be managed. As it turns out, estimate of the amount of cloud storage in actuality was around 5 exabytes. So in 2015, about 2.5 years ago, roughly it was estimated that there were 5 exabytes of content in the cloud. And it's estimated that in 3 years from now, by 2021, that will grow to 130 exabytes. That's a 25-fold increase in terms of just content, media content, being stored in cloud-type environments. Another area where a lot of consumers and a lot of customers especially are seeing a lot of interest in cloud has to do with the elasticity and this ability to handle bursty workloads. If you're in a situation, for instance, where you might be preparing for an event that doesn't necessarily occur on a continual basis, an event, for instance, like the Olympics, being able to leverage the cloud to augment your existing environment, maybe in a hybrid type setting, allows you to actually very quickly take on additional workloads very quickly on a pay-as-you-go basis. And this is of a lot of interest to many of the case studies that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Competitive pressures we talked about. The very last reason right here is one that's just very core to a lot of what I see throughout the industry. I spent about 20 years working on the studio and broadcast and visual effects side of things. So I was actually a customer for many, many years. And much of what we saw is that the value as media technologists working within the media and entertainment industry usually has to do with being able to work with your internal business customers and provide value to them to help optimize workflows, their business processes and whatnot. In most cases, has very little to do with racking and stacking infrastructure, servers and storage and whatnot. We now have many existing customers, and we're going to talk about quite a few of these here in a bit, but we have customers pretty much covering around the globe. Now, actually, AWS has over 1 million active customers across over 190 countries across the globe. And from a media and entertainment perspective, this is just a very small sampling of many of the referenceable customers that we're working with. But as you can tell, a lot of our customers are usually on the studio content creation side or on the broadcast side, maybe on the cable pay TV side, as well as some of the sports leagues. And then we have quite a few folks also in publishing. The manner in which customers are adopting AWS from a media workload perspective really at the origin starts by leveraging a lot of our AWS services that you'll continue to hear about throughout the day that hopefully many of you know about. And a lot of those obviously have to do with storage, with compute, with content delivery network through our CloudFront service, a lot of databases, serverless, and some of the new artificial intelligence services that we'll talk about. So these really represent sort of the core building blocks to help you build out your media workloads, but the manner in which customers approach this really varies. During the early days, we actually had a few partners and few solutions actually running on AWS, so a few of the early adopters, such as Netflix and Sony, back 6, 7, 8 years ago, primarily were building out their own systems themselves and running them directly on these core AWS services. And over time, we've had more and more partner-based solutions that have been running on AWS. Pretty much most best-of-breed partner media solutions are going to be running in an AWS-type setting, and that's become a very common way for most of our customers now to adopt and actually engage with AWS. And as it turns out, most customers really have a hybrid approach. But one of the bigger changes that we're now seeing is almost a pivot for a lot of our customers who really just in the last 2 months especially are beginning to see the advances of some of our native capabilities. We've been making investments in media for quite some time. We acquired Elemental a little over 2 years ago. We acquired ThinkBox on the visual effects side about a year ago or so. And we're very excited about what we're able to do with both of these sets of offerings. In particular, we'll hear a lot more about AWS Media Services with Aslam, who will be following me. But we're just very excited, based on the feedback that we've seen from customers, about this ability to just much more quickly develop and deploy highly scalable video workflows in an AWS-type setting. And really the game changer here is that you can run these AWS native media services directly from within the AWS console. So you can access them very quickly. There's just much less friction now involved as far as trying to build out your video workflows. This right here is just a quick sampling of some of the many things you can do with AWS Media Services. And I'm not going to dive into this. Once again, it's going to be very well covered from our next very distinguished guest, Aslam. But this is really just a quick, easy way of showing how you can build out one of the most basic video workflows that it turns out is probably just one of the most common themes that most media technologists work on. One of the aspects is you're trying to bring content in to the cloud type environment. Once you have the content in, maybe landing it on S3, you're going to use a serverless Lambda to then trigger a file processing event or a transcoding event through Media Convert in this case. Maybe you actually log some of what you're doing through CloudWatch. Maybe you publish that content through Lambda via the use of some of the many other services that we have with AWS Media Services, like Media Store, and then being able to use, for instance, CloudFront to actually stream and deliver. And this is really just scratching the surface, but stay tuned for much more excitement around media services here in a bit. At a very high level, this right here represents the overall media lifecycle. And this, to a large extent, has sort of been one of the holy grails for a lot of media customers who've been looking at trying to actually find ways to benefit from cloud with their different media workloads. And during the very early days of adoption, much of the adoption was primarily happening maybe a little bit with some OTT, maybe some streaming would happen, maybe a little bit of transcoding within media supply chain would be happening in the cloud, and maybe you would store a little bit of your content. But if you fast forward to up until about 2.5 years ago, we really saw a lot of customers wanting to do that much more. And as we started seeing more partners coming on board, and especially with our acquisition of AWS Elemental, it's really opened us up to the possibilities of actually catering to the entire media lifecycle. So much so that now, from initial camera capture, through the use of different forms of acquisition, folks are now acquiring their content directly into a cloud-type setting. They're running even some of their post-production services all in an AWS-type setting. They're then taking the finished content from post-production, and they're transforming it, they're processing it, they're packaging it through media supply chain, and then allowing for the distribution of these packages to the different forms of distribution. Here we have one example that we'll talk about with Discovery for broadcast channel playout. Other examples, of course, are in OTT, many examples there, many examples on the digital publishing side as well. And one of the primary support structures for this is being able to manage your content through the use of DAM, or Digital Asset Management, or MAM, Media Asset Management types of solutions, including being able to manage your archive library, being able to quickly access it once it's in a cloud-type environment. So we've seen, once again, a lot of customers who've been deploying more and more DAM and archive types of solutions. And then one of the newer changes that we're seeing throughout the industry, I'd say newer, where we've really just seen an acceleration over the last 12 months especially, has to do primarily with artificial intelligence. And what's great about artificial intelligence is that it ultimately applies across the entire life cycle. We'll talk about examples of that in a bit. I won't cover this in much detail other than just to call out that all these different workloads, as we saw on the prior slide, these are real workloads. These are real customers doing true work running on AWS, in a lot of cases, leveraging a lot of the media services highlighted and bolded, as well as a lot of the other great AWS services, and then in many cases also leveraging many great partner solutions. So it takes just a whole ecosystem to really allow you to work across the entire life cycle. We'll now just talk through a few of the different workloads. I won't spend too much time on these. But content acquisition is really where a lot of this starts, and there are many ways of capturing your content. We'll hear in a little bit about AWS Elemental Media Live, which is a great way of acquiring content. We also have different ways of doing other types of file-based delivery, and then also using devices to actually allow for the mass delivery of content, such as what Scripps Networks has been doing. Production, post-production is one of my favorite areas. I started in the industry actually on the visual effects side, and my heart is really stayed with many aspects of what I learned back then. And it's just great to see folks actually truly engaging and embracing cloud from a production, post-production perspective. A lot of the earlier work, one of the better use cases for cloud, because of the scalability, because of the low cost, because of the pay-as-you-go, really has to do with visual effects rendering. And this is something that's becoming very commonplace. What we find is that a lot of visual effects houses certainly have, in many cases, their own data centers. Some are full cloud native, but many of the larger ones have their existing data centers. But oftentimes, they'll run into these crunches, like is the case right here with Sony Pictures Imageworks. The head of technology from Sony Pictures Imageworks came and talked to customers at the last reInvent and talked about how this happened just last year. They had plenty of capacity to take on one feature, maybe even some aspects of a second feature that was happening concurrently, at least where there were rendering needs concurrently. And then they got hit with an additional feature that they actually had to render out. And there was just no way they were going to have enough internal on-prem capacity to do this. And so they turned to AWS to actually help manage the build-out and the scaling out of the cores required to help complete the movie. And so in this case, this was pretty cool. They actually were utilizing a little over 60,000 concurrent vCPUs. They were able to spin up in very little time and use that capacity until they actually were able to get through their big crunch and were able to produce a great movie, the Emoji Movie. And they were very happy with the outcome. I think one of the outcomes that this head of technology, Steve Kowalski from Imageworks, was talking about was the fact that they were actually able to get that much more productivity out of the animators, the modelers, the VFX personnel, because those folks were actually able to have more rendering capacity right there at their fingertips. So they were able to send out render jobs and get much quicker feedback and actual shots rendered to see it. Well, We'll skip through some of these examples, but I did want to highlight this right here. You know, a fascinating part of post-production and where most of the work, the truly creative work that we all get to feast on, really has to do with the work happening either from visual effects artists or a lot of editors, folks using NLEs, or even folks doing a lot of sound editing, for instance. And one of the new areas that our customers, some of our customers are now exploring and actually beginning to use in production environments has to do with remoting in, having artists remotely use NLEs, nonlinear editors, or even different visual effects software to do modeling, to do animation, to do dynamics. They're able to log in remotely onto the software that is going to be used from a creative perspective that's running on GPU instances all within AWS. This allows them to not have to worry about the raw compute workstation power in the background, and they can focus once again on what they do best, which is the creative work. Digital asset management has many great case studies, and once again, this is probably one of the more active areas we're seeing across a lot of our customers. This is a really good entry point if you're thinking of moving into the cloud and you're thinking of leveraging all the capabilities and benefits that we're talking about. Digital asset management, along with media supply chain, is one of the natural entry points. I'd say over-the-top OTT as well is certainly a natural entry point. In the case of Sony DADC, DADC is actually the distribution arm for Sony, and much of what they do is they actually manage a lot of content from many different properties. They manage content for Sony Pictures, some of the BBC Worldwide, and many other studios. And they have an enormous amount of that content. And they pretty much hit a point where they had right around 20 petabytes. It was just very difficult for them to have to worry about the infrastructure aspects of managing all this content, of having a performant environment that could scale out quickly, and they could also meet some of the business outcomes that they wanted to achieve as part of their primary business at DADC. They actually have to take all this raw content, the aspects of the 20 petabytes, and they will transform this content, they'll package it up, and then they'll send it out to all sorts of different distribution channels, I think over 1,000 or so, depending on who is needing to be distributed to. And so they came to us, we were able to work with them, and very quickly they were able to actually move over their entire 20 petabytes of content onto AWS. They were able to run a lot of their solutions and even optimize their solutions along the way, and able to actually leverage the elasticity and the high performance aspects of what one can obtain in an AWS type setting. And ultimately, we're able to deliver within approximately an hour, which was their target they wanted to hit, some highly complex workflows with large loads of content, something that previously would take several hours, if not days, to accomplish. Many other examples on the digital asset management side. I'll skip through this one really quickly, but mostly we work with a lot of different partner solutions that run on AWS. One of the greater partners that we work with here is VidiSpine. There are many others, Wazi, and quite a few others that run on us. But what we find once again is that this ability to be able to manage your content in a cloud-type setting is just a great starting point in order to really transform, from a technology perspective, your media workloads. Media supply chain we've been touching on. I'll just make a quick note on the Turner example. So in the case of Turner, Turner owns CNN, and CNN was actually looking for a way to actually manage right around 15 petabytes of content. And they wanted to be able to do this easily. They wanted to be able to shift to a pay-as-you-go model. They wanted to actually increase their ability to run in a more agile type fashion. Once again, one of the ongoing themes here is flexibility and agility. And this is something that Turner actually talked about at the last reInvent, this ability to leverage, for instance, serverless as part of the media supply chain with their content running all and being stored all in AWS, and then being able to run these serverless media supply chain all within AWS and hit some of the different performance criteria and outcomes that they were trying to reach. This right here is an example of a broadcaster in Hollywood that now has been running their media supply chain for about 2 years. They now actually in this case, yeah, it's Fox. And Fox, actually, at the last reInvent, was also talking about, I think they have 10 petabytes or a little bit more now moving onto AWS. And they use a media supply chain, a highly sophisticated one, to automate the process of bringing in content from many different production and source venues. They take that content. Once they've actually ingested it and staged it and extracted additional metadata from it, they then run that content and transform it and prepare it for distribution, and then send it off to a variety of different distribution channels, whether it's for broadcast needs or for OTT distribution needs. Over the top is, once again, where we're seeing just a lot of activity. I'll spend a little bit more time on Hulu, and then we'll probably skip through the next couple examples. But Hulu's a great example of a customer that understands media technology better than most. They actually understand cloud very well. But initially, during the early days, as they were building out the Hulu platform, there were fewer options for them, and the best option for them at that time was to build out their own on-prem service. So they had an on-prem, primarily video-on-demand, VOD service, running all on-prem, and they realized that there was an opportunity for them, from a business perspective, to grow their business by shifting from just being a VOD only to a VOD, as well as a live streaming type of platform. And one of the challenges, actually there are two main challenges they encountered. The first is they didn't necessarily know how quickly their new service would grow. They didn't have enough data to really fully estimate what kind of capacities they would need. And so they wanted an ability to be able to just start small and then allow the capacity to grow based on consumption. The second hurdle for them was a major one in that as far as their live streaming solution, they needed to actually be able to handle 600 concurrent streams at fairly high bit rate. This amounted to an aggregate, they actually have approximately 20 gigabits per second of content continuously flowing through their systems, now running on AWS for their live streaming. And so this was something that they were able to build out fairly quickly with the help of some AWS architects and some of the services that we brought to bear. And ultimately, they were able to hit their deployment targets. They were able to go live based on when they were wanting and needing to do so, and became a very happy AWS Media customer. Netflix, I think I've mentioned a few times along the way, but I think really what excites us about Netflix is they've set the bar very high, I think, in this industry, and they've helped transform many aspects of just media adoption on AWS. They run entirely in the cloud. Pretty much everything they have, near everything they have, actually runs on AWS. They've shut down all of their on-prem data centers. They do amazing stuff, of course, from an artificial intelligence perspective. They have I think over 25 petabytes is what I've heard from them. Roughly over 25 petabytes of just raw analytics content that they use to help with things like recommendation engines. And of course, they have a lot more content that gets streamed to all of our viewing eyes. Amazon Video, another great customer. Many great aspects of Amazon Video in terms of how they're leveraging AWS. They're a tough customer, and as far as we're concerned, they are one of our customers. We compete and need to earn their business every day, but they are great users and provide a lot of good feedback to us in terms of how to build out their business on AWS. And one of the last examples here before I get into digital publishing has to do with Discovery Communications. And this one's an interesting one for us in that until about a year ago or so, it was almost taboo to hear about customers running their broadcast channel playout preparation in a cloud-type setting. And this is something that actually Discovery embarked on doing about a year and a half ago with one of their partners. And they deployed almost, I think about a year ago or so, actually about 9 months ago. And just announced not too long ago, in the last 2 or 3 months, there was an article where they actually touted that all of their US channels are now running and being prepared, all their broadcast streams are being prepared on AWS. Very exciting for us, and it was just great to hear about the business benefits that they had, primarily greater scale and agility, lower TCO, and a lot of flexibility. Once again, common themes we're seeing throughout. Digital publishing, I'll just make mention of The Guardian. Once again, this is primarily about agility in the case of The Guardian. They've been around for a long time, but they came to cloud. They wanted to actually utilize and leverage new technology, in this case AWS, to help their agility, to actually help increase and accelerate the actual releases from 25 to 40,000 over the course of 3 years. Pretty staggering. Last example here on the digital publishing side is Time Incorporated. Of course, another great older company that's been doing a lot of good stuff for many years, wanted to actually leverage capabilities from the cloud. And in their case, it primarily had to do with just lowering cost. We're almost out of time, but one of the areas that I've just become fascinated by, and it's mostly just due to the excitement that I've been gaining and seeing with many of our customers, and it's all around just this new area of artificial intelligence, machine, and deep learning as it applies to media and entertainment. Of course, AI and machine learning has been around for a long, long time. Amazon certainly has a lot of this in their DNA. Amazon's been working with a lot of these technologies for over 20 years or so. And actually, a lot of the same technologies that you see in different Amazon products ultimately are finding their way into AWS services so that all of our customers can leverage them. And it turns out later, you're also in for a great treat with Kiwan, who's going to be able to talk to you in a lot more depth about what can be done with AI/ML running on AWS. There are many different ways, of course, of how you can do it. Most of our customers, where we're mostly seeing a lot of action, is around vision, using services like recognition video, recognition image, and we'll hear a lot more later about that. Speech, of course, with Poly, and even transcribe. Then on the language side with services such as Lex. Some of the more advanced users sometimes want to actually be able to tweak their own models. Folks like Netflix sometimes will come at the platform level. Others may even want to tweak the engine. So there are many different options in terms of how you can leverage AI/ML. But once again, most of what we're seeing is just folks just utilizing these top-level services. And I know I'm pretty much near out of time, but just wanted to call through a few great use cases that we're seeing with our customers. Media metadata tagging as part of ingest processes is very common. Closed captioning, we're still in very early days. We're certainly nowhere near the 100% mark that we ultimately have many customers wanting us to get to, but I know we'll be working our way there, and we're certainly improving very rapidly in this field. Automated compliance marking is also another area that helps many of our customers in terms of just accelerating certain aspects of getting that content out to viewers. Brand detection, especially for ad agencies and others, is a big help. In-scene detection is an exciting one for me as far as content production goes. If you think of digital dailies workflows, for instance, where you're receiving this raw content that's been shot on set, and you're trying to just get through that content quickly. Maybe the editor's trying to better understand at what frame did a celebrity, for instance, enter the scene, at what frame did that celebrity leave the scene. That's all very good, helpful information for an editor. Language translation, content recommendation, obviously something we've been doing and seeing for quite some time. And really, I think the big change here is now you don't necessarily need to be a Netflix with a whole huge army of engineers behind it. We can actually work with you in some of the services and more quickly help you get recommendation engines up and running. Ad personalization we talked about earlier. Fraud detection also of great interest for most of our customers. So leave you with these thoughts in mind. Once again, stay tuned to hear more from the other sessions today. You're going to hear about media services in a bit. You'll hear a lot more about AI. And I thank you for your time.